Hi there, good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to this CECAN webinar, our second webinar in our series, amongst many of our events. My name is Peter Barbrook Johnson. I'm a researcher here in London at the Policy Studies Institute, University of Westminster. I'll be our chair for the session today. We're very grateful to have Justin Jagosh speaking today for us about realist methodologies in policy evaluation. I'll let Justin introduce himself in a moment. But just for those who aren't familiar, CECAN stands for the Centre for Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. We are a research centre funded by UK government and UK departments. Our basic aim, our headline aim, is to pioneer, test and promote innovative evaluation methods. These methods that take into account the complexity of the real world. And we have as our focus nexus issues, nexus being food, energy, water, and the environment. You can read more about our other events and the work we're doing at our website, cecan.ac.uk. Follow us on Twitter, all the usual kind of stuff. So have a read. The format for the webinar today will be that Justin speaks to us for around about 40 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes of questions and answer. And because there's so many of us joining from all over the world, we obviously can't have everyone talking over each other. So the way that I'd ask you to submit your questions is via the chat box, or the question box rather, sorry, that you should see on the GoToWebinar control panel that has popped up when you've opened the webinar. If you could write your questions into that question box, I will then act as chair and ask those questions to Justin at the end, once he's finished speaking. So we'll have about 20 minutes at the end to ask those questions. So yes, please do type away, add those questions as we go throughout the session, as you see fit. You can keep doing that all the way up to the very end. So yes, 40 minutes and then 20 minutes Q&A. So the session will be recorded and hopefully should be available on the website afterwards, and I'm sure Justin will be happy to share his slides. That's me done. I'm going to hand over to Justin now, and he can start off. So just leave me to say thank you very much, Justin, and hand over to you.
So thank you, Peter, and thanks to CECAN for the invitation to speak about realist methodology. There's only so much we can do in 40 minutes, so I'll try to go fairly quickly through my slides, and hopefully we'll have a good conversation after. Just a little bit about me. I, for the past 3 years, since 2013, have been director for a new centre at the University of Liverpool called Centre for Advancement in Realist Evaluation and Synthesis. And in the last 3 years, I have intensified an annual slate of realist methodology training workshops, including an annual summer school and an international conference that happens every 2 years. We just had our international conference in October of 2016, and there are some very valuable resources on the CARES website at the University of Liverpool, which is that website address is on the last slide. We have a realist foundation in the philosophy of science that we can go to the literature and read and contemplate and conceive of ideas. And then we can use realist methodology, and specifically the context, mechanism, outcome, configuration, to really help us try to sort out causation in complex environments. Well, all environments are complex, but it's really about helping to sort out our thinking around what is causing what to happen. And the product of that, over time, if you apply that approach, my hypothesis is that it increases our innate capacity to handle complexity. So I think that's to me very positive, and that's one reason why I'm really dedicated to this approach. And there are not just one realist paradigm, there are many realist paradigms. And I guess the distinction, the main distinction I'm making in this slide is the difference between the philosophy of critical realism and Pawson and Tilley's realistic evaluation. So there is a body of literature and a community of practitioners of applied critical realism, including Roy Bhaskar, Margaret Archer, Andrew Sayre, key authors in the critical realist camp who have applied realist philosophical principles to a broad and sweeping disciplinary and transdisciplinary domain. And Pawson and Tilley in 1997 wrote a book called Realistic Evaluation, which I'm sure many people have heard of, and have been in part influenced by the writings of critical realism, and there are other influences to their work as well. But Pawson and Tilley is really sort of where I'm situated, and it is methodologically focused. It's not philosophically oriented. And you'll see that in '97 there was Realistic Evaluation that came out, and then in 2006 Ray Pawson wrote a book on realist synthesis, applying principles of realist philosophy to the task of literature review. And in 2013, Ray Pawson wrote a book called Science of Evaluation, a Realist Manifesto, where he sort of updated his ideas on realistic evaluation since the 1997 book. And there are other products that are coming out. For example, Jeff Wong and colleagues, myself included, have published reporting standards and publication guidelines for realist synthesis. In 2013 was realist synthesis, and I was involved in the 2016 study, NIHR-funded study to develop reporting standards for realist evaluation. And there is an interdisciplinary practice of people working with realist methodology in evaluation and synthesis. So what is realist methodology? Well, very simply put, you could say that it is a theory-driven approach to evaluation and synthesis. It is mostly used in the assessment of complex evidence coming from the implementation of policy programs, services, and interventions. And that's a key take-home point, that it's really been designed around policies, the assessment of policy programs and services. So if you're doing a research study where there's no intervention or policy that you're aiming to understand, then the way that realist methodology has been described and set up, you may have to innovate your definitions and think about how to apply the concepts to something that is other than policy or program. But I'm assuming that the audience here, everybody were interested in understanding how to assess policy. And it's concerned with understanding context and underlying mechanisms of action, and specifically the interaction between context and mechanism. And I will talk about that in a bit. So just to clarify that realist evaluation or realistic evaluation, those are synonymous terms. This is for primary analysis, so this is for frontline data collection and studying programs as they manifest in real time or after programs have been implemented. And realist synthesis is for secondary analysis, which is literature-based. And so this has gained a lot of interest, especially in the health sector, where systematic review is considered, a gold standard methodology. So because review is considered, the summation and higher ordering of evidence is supposedly, help us synthesis. Realist synthesis has gained considerable attention, but the way you do a realist synthesis is somewhat different from a systematic review in terms of the underlying logic and approach. And maybe we can have a little bit of time to talk about that. So I want to just go back to the roots here and talk about realist philosophy. And there's a concept in the realist philosophical literature called ontological depth. So my goal here is to try to explain some of these more difficult concepts in clear and comprehensible terms. So you can tell me if I was successful in doing that. But I often use this metaphor of an iceberg to try to explain ontological depth. So you can see the iceberg as having two parts, one part above the water and the other part below the water. So the part above the water, you could say, is that which is clearly evident and relatively easy to make an assessment about. Relatively easy, it's not always easy. But what makes it easy is the fact that it is observable, it's viewable, and it's likely viewable by many people. So you could achieve consensus. So, you know, a very simple example is like heart rate or blood pressure, something that's very concrete. It can be measured easily. Then you have the area of the iceberg under the water, and that is that which is less evident and relatively difficult to measure and make an assessment about. So, for example, you know, somebody's feelings about something, fear, trepidation, trust, those types of, that sort of dimension of reality is much more difficult to make an assessment about. There may be a correlation between your heart rate and your level of fear in a certain situation, but the heart rate is much easier to observe, and the fear is much more difficult, especially, you know, as an outsider to it. So what we're saying in the realist approach is that we need to take stock of, we need to take account of both the easily observable as well as the more difficult to observe layers of reality. And this idea that even elements in our environment that have yet to be manifest is part of our reality. It comes from critical realism. We talk about the ontology of absence, which is a very interesting perspective, especially in our evidence-based culture of research, where we prioritize that which has evidence. But then the question is, if there isn't evidence, what are we saying about what are we saying about that which has yet to be evidenced? And I think there's a lot to be said about that. I'm aware that that may raise some questions, and people can ask questions about that. I'm going to move on in my slides just out of time consideration, but there's definitely a discussion to be had. This is a realist ontology. So this is a realist version of what is considered reality, and it's in contrast and contradiction to an evidence-based culture, and there's a critique of the evidence-based culture of research from the realist position. So going further, realist philosophy, understanding generative causation. So this comes from Ray Pawson's article, Causality for Beginners. And he makes a distinction between causation through succession versus causation by generation. And the key here is to understand that the realist perspective is about generative causation. So succession causation identifies vital causal agents as variables or treatments. Research seeks to observe the association between such variables by means of surveys or experimental trials. And it's about constant association or constant conjunction. So the idea that if you can, over repeated cases, see that the same thing is happening, then you develop some confidence in your claim to causality about whether the program is working or not. But causation by generation, he says that measurable patterns and regularities are brought about by the action of some underlying mechanism. The emergence of social uniformities is always highly conditional. Causal explanation is thus a matter of producing the theories of the mechanisms that explain both both the presence and the absence of the uniformity. So here he's really talking about the context and mechanism interaction and saying that if we're saying that there are such things as uniformities, then we, rather than trying to understand, trying to get to the uniformity, we're just trying to understand how this uniformity changes in different contexts. So we're all about context, specificity, and understanding the impact of context on our interventions. So going back to the iceberg, so the successiveness causation is like asking the question, does X lead to Y? And the generative question is, what about X results in Y? And when you ask that question, what is it about X that results in Y, you open yourself up to a completely different line of inquiry, actually. So I have an example here. So the successionist causal question, does A lead to B? So an example question could be, do awareness campaigns work to improve climate change adaptation in regions most vulnerable to environmental disaster due to climate change? So that would be a successionist question, and these types of questions are actually quite common. The generative causal question, again, is what is it about A that results in B? So then the example, corresponding example would be, what is it about awareness campaigns, if anything, that work to reduce vulnerability to environmental disaster due to climate change? So we're wanting to open up the black box of the intervention. So in this case, we're talking about an awareness campaign, but we want to understand the underlying logic of an awareness campaign, the underlying theory, like why it would be considered a good idea to do an awareness campaign in a given context, and those kinds of things. So when we're asking the question, what is it about? That really pushes us into the generative causal mode. And this is another slide, and I apologize for moving quite quickly through these. I know sometimes this takes time to really unpack. But in this slide, this comes from Andrew Sayre's work, and he depicted this in a book, Realism and the Social Sciences. And his argument is that realism inhabits kind of a middle ground between, on the one hand, positivism, and on the other hand, constructivism. And there is overlap. So this is also what makes reading the literature, the realist evaluation and synthesis literature, sometimes it's a little bit not confusing, but just you see the diversity of the underlying paradigm that people are working with. And some people are working more with a realist constructivist lens. Other people are working more with a realist positivist lens. But just in a nutshell, you could argue that positivism is about theory testing, experimentation. Example could include randomized controlled trial. It's about aggregation of data and averages. And the underlying sort of search is for regularities and universal truths. So the question about, did this work? Can we do a study where we can determine that this intervention works? And if you roll up and scale out this intervention and you implement it with fidelity, then we can assume that with relative confidence that we will achieve the goals. And on the other hand, you have constructivism, which is about building theory. It's about observation and perspective, qualitative and case study. And the search here, this is my interpretation, so it's open to dispute. But for me, I see the search as for understanding patterned perceptions and idiosyncrasies. And is it perceived as working? So we're asking people, what is their perception about whether things are working or not? And that's very useful. I mean, and potentially both ends of the spectrum can still be useful. But here what we're saying is that realism inhabits this middle ground and uses an approach to inquiry called retroduction and the search for demi-regularities. So on the one hand, positivism is looking for the universal truths like the regularities. In realism, we're still taking that idea that there are regularities, but they're always demi-regularities because they're always prone to change given contextual differences. So that's all I want to say about that slide. And if anybody wants to ask a question about it in the discussion, you can. I'm just sensitive to time. Usually in a training workshop, we spend a bit more time making sure we understand these things. And I recognize I haven't really explained retroduction, but let me just move forward and maybe it will become clearer. So this is from Pawson and Tilley. I've derived some basic principles of realist methodology. So the previous slide was really coming from more critical realism, Andrew Sayre's work in critical realism. So these points here come from Pawson and Tilley. So they emphasize that realist, well, I am emphasizing, I'm pointing out that realist methodology was designed for the assessment of program services, interventions, and policy, like I said. It's not does it work or what works on average, but what works for whom, under what circumstances, and how. It's based on a logic of mixed methods, and mixed methods is encouraged and promoted. Ray Pawson definitely promotes the use of mixed methods, and mixed methods to get at the inquiry from different perspectives. And it's not just mixed methods. It is what I say is evidence theory configurations. We want to maintain that, keep a very transparent trail of what we're doing and identify that which we have found evidence for, that which we need to theorize and hopefully find evidence for in the future. So evidence theory configurations, it's the idea that intervention do not create change, people do. So that is really bringing in the agency of people into the equation. So we don't ask, did the intervention work? We ask, what resources did that intervention provide? And how did people react to those resources given their context, leading to outcomes of interest? And I have slides coming up that will explain that a bit more. So for socially contingent intervention, the mechanism is how people react or respond to resources. And that's a very key point. And the idea of mechanism, as described by Pawson and Tilley, is something that does take some time to really understand. It's been my experience, personal experience, and I think the experience of many people, that the mechanism is the most challenging concept. And the last point on this slide is that the program strategy is not synonymous with the mechanism. In fact, what we say is that there is a program strategy, and that strategy produces resources, and the resources form the mechanisms. It's that mix of the resource and the reaction to the resource that forms the mechanism. And what's beneficial about doing that is that when you ask the question, what resources does this intervention provide, you brainstorm ideas and of impact, ideas of how this intervention creates impact that can include intended, unintended impacts and diverse causal pathways. So let's see if I can continue to clarify that. But just moving forward with the Pawson and Tilley approach, this slide just shows you in a nutshell the approach to realist inquiry. So you start with identifying a program to be evaluated, and you establish your evaluation questions. Then you sketch out candidate program theories. So candidate theories are theories that are like hypothesized. They're potential theories that you identify at the outset. And then you move through the context, mechanism, outcome, configuration analysis. Not just the analysis, but you use your theories and the CMO configuration to develop your protocol for data collection. You collect data, analyze data using CMO configurations, and in the end you produce evidence-informed program or middle-range theories to answer the questions, what worked for whom, under what circumstances, and how. So the CMO configuration is really sort of the key analytical tool or process used You can use the CMO configuration to sketch out your candidate program theories, develop your data collection protocols, develop your interview guide, or your for synthesis, your identification, selection, and appraisal tools. And then in the end, you are producing evidence-informed theory. That is the goal of the approach. Another thing to understand, way to understand realist program theory is to think of it as like a blueprint, an architectural blueprint. So I've used this metaphor. So the realist program theory should address what works for whom under what circumstances by identifying intervention components. So, and that you might think is quite straightforward, but once you start unpacking it, you might find that there are many components to the intervention that have not ever really been identified explicitly before, but you identified because you recognize that there's a causal impact. So for example, who delivers the program? Say you have an educational program, but who delivers the program? Does that have an impact? So is that a component of the intervention? So these are things that we have to grapple with in terms of what is an intervention component. Then you construct your program theories. You can use if-then statements, and that's becoming somewhat popular now. And that's particularly useful for working with stakeholders who don't have training in realist methodology. And you consult the literature or key stakeholders for validation, and you incorporate middle range theories as needed. And using realist program theory can help us evaluate program success by examining how program theories played out in implementation, conduct ongoing monitoring in real time as the program unfolds, and you can even use this to develop programs. So that there are multiple ways to approach realist program theory development. So again, you can ask me questions in the question period about that. So basic steps to undertake in a realist inquiry: develop or locate initial candidate program theories based on one's prior experience or through consultation with literature and stakeholders. But the key is that theories are not merely descriptive. They paint a causal picture. So what is expected to cause what to happen? And then you develop your research protocols and you gather evidence based on your initial theories. You configure elements of theory and evidence together in CMO configurations. And then you present your research output, which is your CMO configurations and evidence-informed theory about what works for whom under what circumstances and how. Okay, so that just sort of a few slides there kind of saying similar things. This is a key concept for realist methodology as well, social contingency. So here I've accessed this little blurb here from an online blog by a philosopher who says that social changes and patterns are not strongly law-governed. Outcomes are the result of intersecting chains of causal mechanisms. There is no sense in which outcomes are predetermined or confidently predictable, so accidents, random events make a difference in the outcomes as well. This is true at a full range of scales, from large happenings like outbreaks of war to the growth of corporations to the emergence of new set of values about gay marriage. So historical processes and sequences are contingent. We need to pay close attention to the path dependency of social happenings. And so this is very, I think, congruent with the realist approach in terms of understanding when you have an intervention set in a context, there may be many different seemingly insignificant elements to the context that actually have a very strong impact on determining the outcomes or how the outcomes unfolded or whether the outcomes actually did unfold. This is from Poston and Tilley's book in 1997, their diagram on context, mechanism, outcome, configuration. And so the pink oval is like saying that's the context. And within that context, what we're saying is we're introducing mechanisms. If you're limiting the idea of mechanism to interventions, then mechanisms are not necessarily limited to interventions. There are mechanisms that happen in the context as well. But for the purposes of the methodology and for the assessment of programs and policies, you can think of the mechanism as the resource that the policy or the intervention creates and the reaction to that resource. And the context is the backdrop. So anything that happens in the backdrop that's not formally part of the program or policy but that still has an impact on the outcomes. And so that's sort of what I say in this slide here. Another way that people have described the CMO configuration is context plus mechanism equals outcome. So it's really to bring home the point that context and mechanism are in a sort of interaction, a continual interaction. And so we need to tease out the differences. Now, one other interesting point to make is that in some sites, say if you did a study where there was multiple sites implementing an intervention, in some sites, some elements of the context might actually be resources given through the intervention. And over time as well, you may have elements of the context becoming part of the intervention. And elements that you capture in a research process may fit into context or mechanism, depending on the parameters of your intervention that you're studying. This is another way to present context mechanism outcome. So it's like saying that mechanism happens at a layer that's a bit deeper in terms of ontological depth. You think of the iceberg metaphor. So it's like the mechanisms are the more difficult to observe realities. So again, background, context is background, and mechanism is the resource and reasoning. So just to very quickly go through this, the context can be cultural norms, history, economic, financial conditions, geographic, socio-political elements, existing public policy, outcomes of previous stages of program implementation, anything in the physical and social environment. So again, it's really anything that is happening that is not formally built into the program, but is part of the landscape or the environment or the backdrop that has, and it specifically has an impact. So again, when we're doing CMO configuration, we're not necessarily dragging in every aspect of context, because that would just be not doable and quite overwhelming. But we are theorizing, out of all the elements of the context, of the backdrop, what elements really make a difference? What is really having an impact? And there are some general categories, like, for example, affluence and poverty, for example. Those are easy to understand, but there may be more subtle aspects of the context as well that have an impact on outcomes. The mechanism is the generative force that leads to outcomes. It is often, but not always, denotes the reasoning. So it could be the cognitive or emotional reaction to resources offered. So it's in response to resources offered. Mechanisms are not program strategies, as I've said. And they've also, Paulson and Tilly, talked about mechanisms as being triggered by contextual factors. So again, when we're going back to this idea of dormant or latent reality, we can say that mechanisms are sort of exist in a latent form, and they need the right context to be activated. That's been the logic put forth by Paulson and Tilly, that the interaction of context and mechanism is, if you have the right context, the right mechanism will fire. It will get triggered and presumably create the outcome. Mechanisms are underlying entities, processes, or structures. Mechanisms are usually hidden, sensitive to variations in context, and generate outcomes. And just to reiterate, so for social interventions, we use mechanism to refer to the cognitive process, or what turns on or not in the minds of participants when they are offered or asked to engage with a program or intervention. And then outcomes can be proximal, intermediate, or final. It can be qualitative or quantitative data, and include intended or unintended impacts. And the unintended, unanticipated impacts may be very interesting in terms of their ability to help explain what's working, how the intervention is working, or if it's not working, why. Just a very quick example. I just have a few more slides. I know we're almost at time here. So I'm trying to give you an example of a mechanism. So say, for example, you have an awareness campaign to divert clothing that would otherwise end up in landfill to recycling depots. Say it was implemented in Region X, and the campaign consisted of a number of billboards in the area with messages about recycling and a town hall meeting. So one thing that you want to do when you're using the realist approach is you want to unpack program strategies. So here, for example, when you say an awareness campaign, that is too vague to really be useful to develop your realist program theories. So you want to ask, what actually is the awareness campaign? And get to a very sort of, this is how I work. I know different people do it differently, but how I work is to get to that textured analysis where you're very clear about what actually is happening on the ground. So here we have a number of billboards in the area and a town hall meeting. So you could say the mechanism is that participants became aware of the issue after reading information about the environmental problem. So I've made a very, very simple example just for the purposes of our comprehension today. So the idea here is that the resource is the information, and because we talk about resource and reasoning, and then the reasoning is they became aware of the issue. So through reading the information, their awareness increased, and the outcome was increased diversion of clothing to recycling facilities in 6 months following the program. And then you could add context. I don't have time to do that, but you could add a context to this mechanism outcome dyad here, where you could study how this intervention, the billboards, etc., how they worked in neighborhood X versus neighborhood Y. And there might be differences in those neighborhoods, for example, that could explain outcomes. And so you can use the CMO configuration in that way. And then this is, I think, my second to last slide. In a 2015 article, myself and a number of colleagues, we developed this idea of the ripple effect using the CMO configuration, because what we found when we studied community academic partnerships for research, and we asked the question, what impact do these partnerships have on research and other outcomes? And one of the things we had to do when we used the CMO configurations, we had to really see things happening in a stepwise fashion and understanding that there was a ripple effect of outcomes coming from the intervention, that the early stages of the intervention didn't really show results of interest, but there was a building of trust, building of relationships that actually became part of the context in subsequent phases of the research. And I think this is actually quite applicable to a lot of research that we're trying to change behaviors or change policy in complex environments that are changing rapidly. So this is a way, the CMO configuration is a way to work with this complexity, I think. And you can use the CMO configuration in different ways, as evidenced here, the way we've done it here, and you're welcome to read about that in our 2015 paper. So just the last two slides here, the possible goals of the evaluation and review. So you could be questioning the program theory integrity. So the question is the underlying program logic sound? Is it a good idea to do this? You could adjudicate between rival program theories. So is there more than one theory that could apply in the situation? Or you could consider the same theory in comparative settings. So does the assumption work under different circumstances? And in my personal experience, I've found realist evaluation and synthesis to be very useful to clarify what is really going on in a program scenario, to unearth the causal pathway leading to outcomes, to explore contextual determinants or to compare context, to theorize mechanisms, because sometimes you may not actually get to the evidence of mechanisms, but in an initial study you may theorize your mechanisms and then publish those and suggest that these mechanisms continue to be scrutinized using empirical methods in the future, and to define, conceptualize, and scope out the outcomes. So, and that last point as well, I mean, I think it's actually a bigger issue than we acknowledge, that when we're looking at complex interventions, sometimes the outcomes themselves are difficult to understand, or that you have a final outcome goal like reduced emissions from climate change, for example. But how you actually get there through, a chain reaction or a causal process, that a realist approach can help to conceptualize and scope out how outcomes accrue. So I think that's my last slide. So that's, I'm a little bit over time, but I hope that was comprehensible. And now I think we have an opportunity to have questions from the webinar participants. So,
Brilliant. Thank you, Justin. Peter here again. Yeah, we have some questions that have come through already from our participants. If anyone else has a question, please do write it now. If we have time, we can ask them all, I think, with a bit of luck. Sorry, yeah. The first question was asking if you could say a little bit more about the differences between systematic reviews and realist synthesis.
yeah, that's a great question. So and actually I have many slides about that that would be good to present at another time, perhaps. What can I say in a nutshell? Systematic review is, taking it. Systematic review falls within this paradigm of gold standard, where potentially this happens quite often, where systematic review prioritizes certain types of research, studies using certain types of research methodologies, specifically randomized controlled trials, and there's a hierarchical ranking of methodological quality along these lines. So having case study at the bottom and having randomized controlled trials at the top, as RCTs having the most, the idea is that they have the most robust evidence. And so a systematic review may bring together a number of, say, randomized controlled trials and do a meta-regression on that primary data to try to create a larger effect size, to create a larger claim, or not a larger claim, but a stronger claim about whether a program is working or how it's working. But the realist approach flattens this hierarchy of methodological quality, so that qualitative case study designs are really on the same level as experimental and quasi-experimental designs and surveys. We are sort of leveling the playing fields, and we're looking for insight. So insights into why and how programs are working can happen at any stage of a review process, and can happen by reading any part of a published article. So, for example, the discussion paper of a qualitative case study paper on an intervention of interest may yield some very interesting insight that can be built into your program theory. And in a systematic review, that kind of article might be downgraded, or in the appraisal stage might be actually excluded from the retained set of papers. Here in the realist approach, we are really searching for theoretical insights that could happen at any place, and it could also include gray literature. So that's one of the differences between systematic review and realist reviews. I hope that answers your question, but maybe we'll take another question.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's obviously all of them we could talk much more.
How many questions are there?
So we have 4 in total, and then I have a bunch as well. But the next question we have, hopefully a little bit more specific maybe, is how would you define a middle range theory, and could you give an example?
Yes. Okay. So what I'm about to say is my opinion and my opinion only. So you will very likely see other definitions of middle range theory. I'm just using this because this is how it makes sense to me. There's a difference between program theory and middle range theory, in the sense that program theory is really about explaining how your program is working. So program theory is really corresponding to the specific program or the intervention that you're working with. Middle range theory is a theory that sort of around a concept that can be pulled into your program theory development to help to conceptualize your program theory. So in the work that we did in participatory research, we studied academic community collaborations. We pulled in a theory of partnership synergy, which is this idea that groups can achieve more working together than they could if they were working in isolation. So that was the primary theory that we found from the literature, and it's pinned around a concept. So the concept is synergy. So that's not relating specifically to the interventions we were studying, but when we brought that into our analysis, we found that it provided what I call a conceptual currency, a way to understand the analysis, to push the analysis forward. So there are many different theories out there that can be turned into middle-range theories that are pinned around concepts, so like empowerment theory, trust theories, candidacy theory of candidacy or normalization process. Those can be middle-range theories. And the program theories, if you think of your if-then statements, if you do this, then this is expected to happen. That's a nice sort of distinction. Program theory is more specific to your intervention. Middle range theory is more specific to a concept that can then be pulled into your analysis to help with your analysis. So I know I said that's really a soundbite answer, but I hope that addresses the question.
Thank you, Justin.
Peter, do you want to ask another question?
Yeah, they're flying in now, the questions. I've got another one here. It's a little bit long, but I'll try and do it justice. So we have a question here about carrying out realist reviews. And the participant asks, for various reasons, for example, word limits or scope, academic papers frequently do not identify or explore mechanisms at play. And then the question is, how do we manage this when undertaking a realist review? Is it part of the theorizing testing cycle? What can we do when lack of evidence means testing is not possible?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and actually something that is very commonly found. So it's exactly that. You're doing a review, a realist review, but the authors of the primary studies retained in your review didn't write their articles with the idea that somebody will be looking for the mechanisms. And so then there's an inherent paradox there, that you're trying to get to ontological depth in a review, yet the papers don't reflect that. So there's a few options. One, you could mix in qualitative interviews into your review process. So you could have a component where and this is what we did in our review. We did an extensive realist review of community-based participatory research, and then we contacted authors of those papers and asked them if they would be willing to be interviewed. And that yielded more of the mechanisms because we had their papers, and so during the interview we said, okay, so we see this in your paper, what do you think was going on here? How do you attribute cause to this or that? And otherwise, if you don't have the resources to do an additional component where you interview people, you do need to create a very transparent trail about what is evidence and what is theory in your review. Because you may feel, due to your own expertise or the expertise of your stakeholders, that there's something to be said here that's missing in the literature that needs to be held still. We need to keep holding the idea or the theory, and so you need to incorporate those theories in your analysis, and even if they're not formally tested, if you can't actually find evidence for those theories, you can still keep them and say that these theories were identified by the expert team and need to be scrutinized in future realist projects, including ones where you interview people. That would be my short answer to that. It's a great question. It's an important question. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Justin. Next question. There's still plenty more, so I'm sure we'll fill up the time, if not overrun. The next question we have, one I had myself, I think, first of all, the participants thanked you very much for the wonderful presentation. Then they asked, could you explain a little bit more what is meant by demi-regularities?
So demi-regularity is simply the idea that the realist approach doesn't take the idea of regularity or universal. The realist approach is saying that people can't get to the universal truth, or that there's no such thing as universal truth. In fact, what there is truth that's always conditional based on context. So demi-regularity is like saying that yes, there are regularities, there are patterns. Like a regularity is like a pattern and a recurring pattern, but it's always demi because that pattern is always subject to change in different contexts or different time points even. So time point 1 to time point 2, there could be changes in that regularity. So we're always searching for those demi-regularities, those things that are basic patterns that are subject to change based on context. Okay, I hope that's clear. Okay, Peter, next question.
Yeah, so we've got about 3 minutes left, and we have 3 questions. So keep them short and sweet.
Okay.
The next.
I'll try.
Would you have any advice or insight into how to construct and or measure counterfactuals in realist evaluations of interventions in complex environments?
Well, I mean, that's a very well-worded question. How to construct counterfactuals in realist evaluation. I can't answer that in a minute because that's a question that really opens up a very interesting discussion, because as some people may know, there is a current debate about whether counterfactual logic is congruent with or antithetical to the realist approach. And I have colleagues who have written, because there's a group that has written about, who is promoting the idea of a realist randomized controlled trial. So merging realist logic with counterfactual logic. And then there are people on the other side of that argument that say that the counterfactual logic is really incompatible with the realist approach, because counterfactual logic is based on a successionist causation, and realist logic is based on generative causation. And so you can't integrate those. Now, but maybe there is some room there, because you could still do a counterfactual, so an experimental design where you have a control group and an experimental arm. And within the experimental arm, you could do a realist evaluation. But you're not necessarily going to compare across the sites, but you may still be able to do a realist evaluation where you theorize even within one site, or all the intervention sites, for example, how the intervention is working. I mean, there's much more to be said about that, but hopefully that gives you something.
I think that's a
all right. Question.
I think that's a pretty good quick answer. Next question. Yeah. In defining CMOs, is it okay for more than one mechanism to fire for a given participant? For example, in evaluating an energy efficiency intervention, we might identify a financial incentive mechanism and a, quote, being green mechanism. But in practice, an individual could have a mix of these motivations. Would these count as separate mechanisms?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's very, very good. And they would count as separate mechanisms, but they may not necessarily have separate contexts. So when you're doing the analysis, you may have one context dimension that you're linking with different mechanisms, or you may have different context dimensions linking with the same mechanism. So all of those things are possible. But if you're saying that there are multiple motivations, internal motivations and motivations coming from a new intervention, plus motivations that are already there, say people are already pre-motivated to do something good because they've been hearing about climate change for a long time, for example. So you can tease these out, and you can create separate mechanisms and separate CMO configurations. But there are no hard and fast rules with the CMO configuration as a heuristic. It is used as it makes sense to you to help you come to that generative causal claim. And how you do that, there's variation in that. So, you just need to feel your way through it and then create a transparent reporting of how you use the CMO configuration. And I always encourage people to create a definition of terms, CMO, and how you have defined those terms to help the reader. Yeah. And was there one last question?
Yes, I mean, I have a whole bunch myself, but I'll prioritize the questions from the participants, of course. The last question was, how can we incorporate the evolving nature of an intervention, for example, trust between partners, into the conceptualization of mechanisms?
Yeah, well, I mean, I encourage you to read our 2015 paper, and if you can't find it, you can always email me. But this is what we did find, that you know, we modeled we modeled the the progression of trust in a collaboration over time, because trust is one of those difficult concepts you can't measure this with empirical methods. Some people have tried, but it doesn't resonate with me anyway. So modeling it is useful to try to understand the impact of trust, but it's a very complex concept, because you could also have mistrust that could be beneficial, and you could have too much trust as well, which leads to collusion, which something that Nick Tilley had pointed out to me at the 2016 conference, which was like a light bulb moment for me. So I'm saying this because there are complexities and there are ways to model it. It's hard to answer it in a sound bite. But you can model it and present your model of how trust emerges over time as your output of your research, and that could potentially be very useful, I think. But it's a great discussion question. I'd love if we had more time to discuss. But you feel free to send me an email if you need clarification, or if you want me to send you that paper. Right, I feel like I haven't really done much justice to these questions, but I guess much of it is just time limitation.
I think, yeah.
Peter, yeah.
I was going to say, I think I've learned a huge amount. I think the questions, I hope, and several of the participants have written back to say thank you for your answers. So yeah, of course, I encourage anyone to get in touch with Justin if they have more questions. I can only leaves me really to thank you very much for your time today, Justin, and your very interesting talk. Of course, with Justin's blessing, we'll put the webinar and the slides up on the CECAN website so people can look at them again in the future. And of course, check the website to get in touch with anyone at CECAN or Justin if you have any more questions. So unless you have anything to add, Justin, I just say thank you very much to you and thank you to our participants.
Thanks, and just a little plug on my end that I am running 3 Realist training workshops at the end of April in London and Liverpool, and I also have an online tutoring program as well, and you can find all that at the website. So this website here, the Liverpool Cares website, it'll direct you to another website, a new website that I have, and there's information there. So feel free to get in touch about that as well. And thank you, everybody, for your attention, and thank you, Peter, for hosting the event.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.